Why tarnish your invaluable luster with a battle in the House? It's a rat's nest in there. It's the same gang of talentless hicks and hacks who rejected the amendment 10 months ago will lose.
I like our chances now.
Then you're gonna sneak 007 over here into a country that wants CIA blood on their breakfast cereal, and you're gonna walk the Brady Bunch out of the most watched city in the world.
Asked about 100 militia at the airport. That's right.
We did suicide missions in the Army that had better odds than this.
I'd like to know what Maya thinks.
We're all incorporating her assessment in ours.
100% he's there. Okay, fine, 95%, because I know certainty freaks you guys out, but it's 100.
Zero, Dark 30, Argo, and Lincoln. A lot of politics up for Best Picture this year. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Here with our second roundtable, joined by George Will, again, Democratic strategist, ABC News contributor, Donna Brazile, Stephen Brill, the author of a new Time cover story that's getting an awful lot of attention this week on healthcare costs. We're going to talk about that as well. Why Medical Bills Are Killing Us is the title. Stephen Rattner, late of the Obama administration, financier, and also Kim Strassel of the Wall Street Journal. I want to start talking about the sequester. It is hitting on Friday. The public doesn't seem to mind all that much yet, doesn't seem to be paying too much attention. Pew poll out this week, about 49% of the public say they want to delay the cuts, but 40 say let them go into effect. Most of the blame, at least right now, seems to be heading towards the GOP. 49% say they should bear the blame for this, only 30% for President Obama. But Kim, you argued in the Wall Street Journal this week that the Republicans are actually in a strong political position. You say that sequester isn't some GOP fallback position. It's a proactive strategy, their way of busting out of the Groundhog Day cycle and changing the Washington spending debate. They aren't bluffing.
Look, this is where they want the debate to be, on government spending. You go back 2 months ago, all the focus was on all of the lack of unity in the party, how they were going to lose on the tax question. Now they've brought this back to the issue that they think matters, which is size of government, whether or not we're spending too much, what the drag of federal spending is on the private economy. And increasingly, they're bringing it back to this one central question, which is really the only question in this debate, which is to the White House, and it is, are you honestly saying that you can't cut $85 billion out of a $3.8 trillion budget?
Well, the sequester was always meant to force a compromise in a balanced way of spending cuts as well as revenues. It was not intended to shut down the government or to have one side win an argument when both sides agree that we need to have a more robust economic growth and a plan to solve this problem, not just in the short term, but, you know, in the long term as well.
The $85 billion number itself is the wrong number. That's budget authority. The CBO says, Congressional Budget Office says, actual spending cut would be $44 billion in this fiscal year. That's less than Congress shoveled out the door, ostensibly to help the victims of Superstorm Sandy, but actually to get around the appropriations.
But George,
process.
it is on top of $1.5 billion in cuts that have come over the last year and a half. Trillion, excuse me.
Well, still, let's look at this, because we're being told by the president that these are severe, brutal, eviscerating, meat cleaver, those are all his words, approaches. 2.4% of spending, 0.5% of GDP, about half of what we spent bailing out AIG. The domestic agencies that would receive, on average, a 5% cut, received from Mr. Obama in the last 5 years 17% increases. So the president's position has to be, the logic of it is, the government right now is the minimal government that stands between us and misery and chaos.
But that's not the president's position, but let's start with some facts, because it's not a 2% cut. You kind of slid in there what is the fact, which is that these cuts are focused heavily on what we call domestic discretionary spending, education, transportation, R&D, things that actually matter, and these are 5% cuts. It's $1.2 trillion with that and defense over the next 10 years. As George said, on top of $1.7 trillion of cuts that have been voted in the last 2 years, all on these same programs. I don't think the president is opposed to talking about spending. I'm certainly not opposed to talk about it, but let's talk about it, as somebody said in the previous panel, let's use a scalpel, not a meat axe. Let's put everything on the table, including entitlements and including revenues. Revenues were increased at the end of last year, but only by a small amount relative to the amount of spending cutting that you guys are talking about. So it needs to be a balanced approach.
But this is the point. It doesn't have to be that way. I mean, this is up to the White House. You could fix this tomorrow.
It's not up to the White House.
No, you could fix this tomorrow. Just move the $85 billion. Are you actually saying subsidies to crony companies, slush funds, duplicative programs? There's plenty of ways to move that money into something that actually makes sense. All you have to do is ask, as Chairman Rogers was talking in the last panel, for the flexibility to do so, or put over their own proposals for where you move it to.
Absolutely. The president has a proposal for where to move it to. The Republicans are not interested. Hikes. No, not just tax hikes. He's proposed $600 billion of spending cuts as part of his $1.2 trillion deficit reduction package. So he has spending cuts in it. He's prepared to do that. The Republicans would rather say, the sequester is the president's idea, but we're not going to allow anything to happen to it because we want it to go into effect so everybody will see that it was the president's idea, even though it will have a very material effect on the economy.
Something as an outsider, what I don't understand about this is everybody says it's a terrible idea, an awful idea, and yet everybody voted for it. And the White House keeps repeating that they want a balanced approach, and the president has all these cuts in mind, including cuts to entitlements, but I haven't seen anything specific that he's proposed. For example,
the president's put at least two specific entitlement cuts on the table. He's proposed on the consumer price index and Social Security. He's proposed limiting that. He's proposed raising the age for Medicare eligibility.
He did that. The president has come up with 3 different plans at various times post a sequester to try to force the Republicans to come back to the table to bring revenues into the equation.
When has he put out a statement saying, let's raise the Medicare age to X? I haven't heard that.
All right, well, look, a couple of things. First of all, the president has talked about raising the Medicare age. I think
to what?
To 67. But wait a minute, in fairness, I think he has also backed off that a little bit for reasons that we can talk about. But the fact is the president has a plan. This is his plan. $1.4 trillion of cuts over the next 10 years, balanced between revenues and spending. He's ready to have a dialogue. The Republicans, you guys are saying you actually like the sequester. You think it's fine that the government can cut this amount of money. So, okay, that's your position. Now let's let it happen, and we'll see who's right.
But I want to go back to what you said, Mr. Rattner, about this is going to knock the economy sideways. $44 billion or $85 billion out of a $1.6 trillion economy. At the end of the Second World War, with predictions that this was going to cause chaos and pain all over we cut federal spending 40% in 1 year. And what resulted was what we call the post-war boom.
I did not say it was going to knock the economy sideways. I said it was going to have an effect. Okay, well, I said it was going to have an effect on the economy. In the macro sense, I think economists are talking about a few tenths of a percent off GDP. It might not sound like a lot. In a fragile economy, it is a certain amount. But there are specific programs that are going to be affected. What every unemployed person gets is going to be reduced by 11% once this sequester goes into effect. There are going to be fewer agriculture inspectors to stand in food processing plants, which means those plants can't process food.
One of the things
this is all going to happen.
I think the Democrats are counting on is that sometime in April or May, when this all starts to kick in, the Republicans are going to break again.
They're not going to, because they have put this central to their strategy. They chose to do this. They want to have this debate. Again, it's not a fallback. Because, I mean, look, I think that there are a couple of dangers here for the White House. They are warning of doom and gloom. How bad is it actually going to be when it happens? That's a big question that has not yet been answered.
We just don't know,
we don't, and we don't also know, a lot of people are not paying attention to this. How many Americans, this is not a government shutdown, okay? People are still going to get their passports, they're still going to visit national parks, they're still going to do all the things they're used to doing. How many Americans are paying attention, and how many are going to decide that this is the Armageddon that the president is
It's a government slowdown. The shutdown might occur on March 27 when the CR, the continuing resolution, runs out. But this is going to have a real impact on the regional economies all across the country, whether it's the threat of furloughs to federal employees. George, we have to brace for it in the Washington region, of course. But look, don't be so giddy, George. But the truth is that it's going to have an impact on children in Head Starts, teachers, firefighters, first responders. People who live in subsidized housing will see their checks drop. So this is going to hurt the economy at a time when people are finally getting their sea legs back.
And George, the economy doing fairly well right now, was on track for about 3% growth. But if you add the effect of the sequester, if it holds, along with what the tax increase that came at the beginning of the year, economists now saying that could take over 1% off of the economic growth this year.
Some economists. other economists deny that you can have a discernible effect on, again, a $16.4 trillion economy with $44 billion. It's
also, couldn't you maybe have a positive effect? Look, what markets are worried about is the size of the deficit, the size of the debt. They actually want some proof that Washington is making a start at fixing this problem. You do this, you let this go into effect. Hopefully you do it in a more targeted and intelligent and flexible way. But you do this, you send a signal to the markets that Washington is making a start. That could help the economy.
But what every poll also shows is that what the American people want is a balanced approach. They want a balance between spending and taxes. As we said earlier, we've cut $1.7 trillion out of this relatively small part of the budget. We're eating our seed corn. Our spending on R&D and infrastructure as a percent of our economy has gone down by half over the last 20 or 30 years. We're not investing in the future, and these kinds of cuts are the worst possible kinds of cuts.
What the American public also wants is health care they can afford and health care that works for them, and that gets to the subject of Steve Brill's cover story in the Time magazine this week, as I said, sending shockwaves to hospitals across the country. Let's put up the cover right there. Bitter pill, why medical bills are killing us. And you have some real shocking details here, Steve. You talk about sky-high medical bills for going to the emergency room for a fall in the face, people paying $1.50 for an aspirin, $300 for an x-ray that costs Medicare $20, but that's just the beginning.
Right, and it actually bears on the conversation we're having because a chunk of that money is paid by Medicare. Medicare, as I point out in the article, is very efficient at most things. It buys health care really efficiently, which is a great irony because it's supposed to be, the big government bureaucracy. Where Medicare is not efficient is where Congress, because of lobbyists, have handcuffed Medicare. Medicare can't negotiate what it pays for any kind of drugs. It can't negotiate what it pays for wheelchairs or diabetes testing equipment. And if Congress took those handcuffs off of Medicare, you could get about half of the spending cuts that we're sitting around here talking about.
Is that true?
You could get a fair amount. And look, if Medicare were simply able to get the same prices for prescription drugs that Medicaid gets, it would save $120 billion over 10 years. So that's roughly
actually a little more.
But there's a fundamental point here, Stephen. I thought your piece was great, and I think your points are right. But I also don't want people to be confused. I don't believe that we can cut our way, change the pricing, do all the things you're talking about, and still save Medicare. The average person who is at Medicare retirement age has paid in something like $122,000 into the system. They will get back $387,000 of benefits. That's 3 times. You're not going to reduce that $387,000 by hospital cuts and this and that. We have to still have fundamental Medicare reforms to make those numbers work.
If you put Medicare in the context of the larger healthcare system, and this is something that everybody at this table is going to think that I should go to a mental hospital when I get finished saying this. The government and all of us would actually save money if you lowered, I said lowered, the age for Medicare. If the Medicare age were 60 instead of 65, the economy and the taxpayers would actually save money. And George, please don't look at me like that. I'm being serious.
You're potentially right. And part of the argument about raising the Medicare age to 67 is you're taking people out of the Medicare system, which is very efficient.
And what you'd be doing is you'd be putting the most efficient player, which is Medicare. Medicare spends 80 or 90 cents to process a claim, and the health insurance companies spend $18 or $20 or $25 to process a claim. The health insurance companies pay 2 or 3, 4 times what Medicare pays for various services. So if you lowered the age, you would put more people into the bucket of much more efficient health care. And the worst part about it is that the reforms that we have now with the president's plan are actually going to raise the cost because all the people who are 60 or 62 or 63 who can't afford the premiums that they're going to have now are going to be subsidized by the taxpayers.
George, well, that becomes an argument for a single-payer system.
Yeah. That's very fine.
That is one argument. Here's an argument against that for a different kind of reform. All the big numbers, billions and trillions, 12 cents is the most important number. 12 cents is the portion of every health care dollar paid by the person receiving the health care. Right. Someone else is paying the rest. It was 47 cents 50 years ago when Jack Kennedy was president. Now, let me ask the 5 of you a question. You go to the doctor and he or she says, I want to give you the following test. How many of you 5 say, how much is that going to cost?
Say, give me two.
Yeah, right. The one for my kid.
Don't bother, because the doctor can't tell you either.
Right.
We have George, you are completely wrong. We have tried that experiment with 30 to 50 million Americans who don't have health insurance and have to pay 100% right now. And they have no choice. They are powerless consumers. If you go to an emergency room and a doctor says to you, you need a CAT scan, and the doctor may not even say it, they may just do it. You're not sitting there as a consumer saying, gee, I wonder if this is the most efficient emergency room. I wonder if I really need that CAT scan.
We have not actually tried that experiment. No, we haven't, because we only have a small group of Americans who are doing that. We have a much larger group of Americans, like George says, who are getting their health care through their companies, and it's largely paid for them, and they have no skin in the game. The important part about your piece was that you mentioned that this is a seller's market. There is no transparency in the market. There's no competition. There's no ability for consumers to look around. We spend hours deciding which toaster we're going to buy. We put no such thought or work into where we're going to get our health care. And you have had companies like Safeway who've worked with their employees to introduce some transparency, and you've seen a big reduction in health care costs.
There's a difference between buying a toaster and buying a CAT scan.
This is a huge moral question for the country, because I agree with George that right now most Americans do not see price in deciding whether to use healthcare. You see price in toasters, you see price in cars and homes, everything else. In healthcare, you don't see price. And therefore, I have to believe, and I think your piece alluded to this, that when people go on Medicare, they really don't see price. They tend to consume more than they otherwise would. 26% of all Medicare spending is last year of life. We don't know how much of that is really efficacious spending. These are really tough moral questions for the country, but we're going to have to deal with them if we're really going to get health care.
Well, what you're getting to, though, is the fundamental question. Are you going to let consumers make those choices about end-of-life decisions, or are you going to have Medicare make a decision about what procedures you can have and how much they'll pay, and government make those choices? That's the moral point.
If the consumers you have in mind have the money, because you're saying they're not going to have insurance, have the money to make those decisions the way my friend Mr. Rattner can. And that is not the world we live in. They're making decisions now, those consumers who don't have insurance, because they don't have the money, they can't write the checks, they're being sued for their bills. You know, this world you describe.
But once they go on Medicare, they're in a different position.
Once they're 65,
no,
if they're 64.
The point all of us are trying to make is that people who have either private insurance or Medicare probably, almost certainly, consume more medical service than they need because they don't see price.
The point is that for everyone else, it's a crap shot.
The uninsured is not the germane cohort here. The germane cohort are people with high deductible insurance. That is, no one expects your automobile insurance to cover your windshield wipers or your oil changes. Insurance is for large, unpredictable events. People who buy high deductible insurance, and we now have enough of them that we have real data, two things. They use the healthcare system less, and there's no discernible health cost to it.
I want to get to one more issue before we take a break, and that is, it seems like so much of the rest of the agenda has been bogged down in the face of all these budget fights, especially this gun control, which was so much a part of the president's pitch at the beginning of the year. Last night, Wayne LaPierre of the NRA coming out hard against universal background checks.
Background checks, it all sounds so reasonable. But don't you be fooled. It's aimed at registering your guns. And when another tragic opportunity presents itself, that registry will be used to confiscate your guns.
Donna, Brazile, it does seem as if this whole effort has slowed down.
No, it hasn't. It's gone on. Joe Biden is the public face of it. He's out there meeting, and he was in Newtown last week. He's traveling all across the country, meeting with law enforcement officials. Patrick Leahy will be putting together some proposals, a Senate Judiciary Chairman, to try to advance this at the end of the month. Gun safety laws are still topic A across the country, from Tucson to in Colorado and Maryland. State lawmakers are taking the initiative, and I think Mr. Wayne LaPierre is on the wrong side of history.
No, it has slowed down, but the reason it has slowed down is because the president's own party is divided on this issue. And so when you look in the Senate, there is a lot of disagreement among Democrats themselves over most of the president's agenda, in particular the ban on semi-automatics, known as assault weapons ban, things like magazine restrictions. And so there's going to be a lot of fights, but it's going to be between Democrats, and that has put them in an unusual spot, and we're leaving.
Only the 6 Democrats who are running for re-election, and we keep focusing on those 6.
It's not about number.
The Democrats support the Second Amendment, right? It's those Democrats. It's about assault weapons, rifles, and these military-style weapons, and should we get them off the streets? And many Americans believe we should.
Get them off the streets, precisely. The president went to Chicago this week. Chicago has more gun homicides in New York, although New York has 3 times the population. What's the difference? The difference is different police measures. And New York, with a lot of controversy, has had stop and frisk, and it's had a measurable effect on gun violence. It's not sexy, it's not a federal program, it's at the local level, and it works.
It did appear, though, that there was going to be a consensus on background checks. Even that, though, now appears to be fraying just a bit.
Yeah, I think the polls show 93% of Americans are in favor of background checks, and so you see Wayne up here and you wonder about it. But I think the problem here is that what history would tell us is time is not your friend on something like this. If you go back to 1968, when Lyndon Johnson was trying to pass gun control, he'd been trying to pass it since President Kennedy's assassination. After RFK and Martin Luther King, it seemed like a no-brainer it was going to get passed, and then it just slowly got in the mud, and we got a very watered-down bill.
Okay, we're going to take one more quick break.